Hi, I'm Ashley Swartz. I hope that if you're watching this, you are safe, you're at peace, and you're in just a good place because it's hard to be in a good place of late. So, I'm the CEO of Furious Corp, and I'm the dean of the faculty for Beat University. I want to thank Andy and Katie for making this happen. This is our eighth class of Beat U, and so we've been doing this for a while. And for those of you that started at the beginning or went back and watched some of particularly the first episode we have, or the first class that was in session, you know that I started doing this during COVID because I personally, selfishly needed to have a sense of purpose during the lockdown and quarantine and everything. I needed to be a lighthouse in the darkness. So who I am as a person is I try and lead my life with an open heart and loving kindness. And in this moment, more than any moment in the last 3 months, my heart is really heavy, as I suspect a lot of yours are. And my desire to be a lighthouse is stronger than ever. But finding how and where to start and what to do has been the hardest part for me. So I'm blessed to have a voice and a platform, and I'm grateful to Andy for giving that to me. And I feel it would be remiss today to leverage one of these classes to not address the big gorilla in the room. And that is the current unrest in our country and the role that media, our industry, we play in stoking fires of division, fear, and hate. And having a very honest conversation about that. A conversation that is not political, not about your party affiliation, not about wrong or right, but about being human and about love and what that means. And so I want to talk about that today. So before you tune out and you think I'm going to get super preachy, I'm not. I'm going to talk about television. I'm going to talk about television advertising in the context of this moment in time, this unprecedented moment in time of history in our country. And more importantly, I'm going to talk about how sellers and brands can do good and do well. And in doing so, be part of the change that is going to heal our nation and is needed to heal our nation. So the Reverend Dr. King said, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. So when the noise of hate fills our news, our television programming, social media, and now our streets, we must shine a light of love that is so bright that it becomes the signal that leads us out of the darkness. I have some ideas that I'm going to talk about today, how we as an industry can be a lighthouse for our nation and ultimately be a lighthouse that provides that beacon of hope. I never thought that in preparing for a segment for Beat or anything in the industry for work that I would go back and do a little refresher and read the Bill of Rights. But I did that over the last couple of days. And I found myself diving into constitutional law and particularly unpacking and reading the sort of interpretation and rulings of Supreme Court Justices Brandeis and Holmes, and particularly their interpretation of freedom of the press. So I was drawn there because of what happened last week. So Friday morning, I got up as I normally do, sipping my coffee, checking out my news, the news that I choose to read, and my news feeds. And I was, shown. I sort of came upon a video of CNN correspondent Oscar Jimenez being arrested. So he was, covering the Minneapolis protests. Was standing. There was a moment of calm or sort of break in the violence, and there was a moment of calm. There was a line of officers behind him in full riot gear, and he was there with his crew. He was covering it. They came over to him, and he told them he was standing where he was told to stand. He'll happily move. He was with the press. He was respectful. He was professional. He openly expressed that he would happily abide by whatever direction he was provided, and that he was here with CNN. And one of the police officers proceeded to arrest him, not provide him with cause, not Mirandize him, and then take him away. That officer didn't know the camera was running. And then those officers continued to do that to the entirety of his crew while the camera was placed on the ground and continued to roll the live feed back to CNN. So this is why the First Amendment is the foundation of a free democratic nation. It's so that we as the people can be aware and can stop injustice and tyranny with knowledge as a weapon of power. That's the role the press plays, and that's why freedom of the press is so important. The press is a medium through which we report, we make aware, and ultimately hold accountable those in power to uphold democracy and protect our liberties. On Friday morning, I was disturbed and despondent because one of the first things taken from citizens in the midst of tyranny is the freedom of the press. And then I began to think about the role of media. Self-awareness. I was being self-reflective, my industry. And in particular, I then sort of started to think about local and cable TV news and in the waves of this sickness that have broken our nation. First, the sickness of a virus, and now the sickness of racism, rearing its ugly head. It's not like it's new. I just want to be very clear. So what's our role as an industry? When we look in the mirror, what do we see? What do we see looking back at us? Do we see champions for democracy? Do we see a platform for propaganda? A medium that encourages hate and plants fear? A cornerstone of a free society? A place where hope can be found? The truth lies somewhere in the middle of all of those. But a more important truth is that straddling the line between hate and hope, somewhere in the middle, will not make media part of the solution. It will only continue to be part of the problem. Sellers lost most of their most valuable inventory on television due to COVID. But television ratings for news programming are the highest they have been in 20 years on both cable and national broadcast networks. Clearly, Americans rely on social media as well for news, and that's ever increasingly more Americans. But evening national broadcast news programs viewing is up 35% year over year, reaching a combined 29.4 million viewers for the first 6 weeks of COVID from mid-March of this year. Adults 25 to 54, a very, very attractive segment, viewing news have risen by 49%. And the three most watched cable networks in April were the news networks. Fox News in total day was up 65% year over year, averaging 2.2 million viewers, with its second best month ever since the Iraq War and coverage of that in 2003. As Bill Maher calls it, the panic porn of COVID drew audiences. But in May, those audiences spoke by their actions and their viewing behaviors, because all broadcasters and networks saw audiences decline due to what Pew Research calls pandemic fatigue. Pew Research found that 71% of Americans need a break from the news, and 43% say that emotionally the news makes them feel worse. Makes them feel worse. Stop, pause, just reflect on that, metabolize that, digest it, right? When the mental health of Americans is negatively impacted by programming on television, we have to pause and ask why. So during a time when Americans need hope and light, yes, there is crisis to report, but they need hope and light and to be informed and connected more than ever. There's something wrong if it literally is damaging to their mental health to watch television. Wrong because I know there is another side to the narratives we are leaning into. I know that. I know it because I've sought stories of hope and light to find that for myself over the last 3 months, and more than ever and voraciously over the last 5 days. And I've found them, but I don't see them on television as part of the day-to-day narrative that we tell we tell America about America. We, about our politics, our citizens, our country, our state of our nation. We don't prioritize that and give the good as much airtime as we give the bad. So as I've said before, one of the reasons that I love television and I'm so proud to be part of this industry is, and I believe in it, is because it brings people together, families, fans, super fans on social media and other places. TV is a shared experience. It has the power to help Americans heal and find our shared sense of humanity and community again. But instead, when it matters most, we've proven to be fuel to the fire of hate and conflict and despair and division. The First Amendment has provided air cover to the media industry for decades. We can't forget that or forsake that. It's afforded us protection from censorship and freedom of expression. For those of you that need a refresher, just thought you might want to join me, we can level set here. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. It is now the media industry's turn to return the favor and afford the same protection to American citizens by leveraging the freedom of press to prevent the further spreading of hate, propaganda, fear, and tyranny under the label of news, and to use content and media to unite our nation instead. That's our job. At least I think it is. It is not just the constancy of negative headlines that play on fear and panic to attract audience and attention, whose impact on our nation we need to consider. We must also stop our silence or avoidance in the absence of diversity, lead actors of color, heroes of color, and stories that speak to all America in our programming, in lieu of just the privileged white Americans, which we mostly speak to today. I feel like the universe is speaking to us because literally the skies just opened and it has gotten dark and the winds are coming. So I want to be clear that I think part of the reason this is important to me is because the irony can't be lost that coupled with the freedom of press and religion, is the freedom of religion, the freedom to assemble, which is protest. And all of this is contained in the First Amendment. Literally, my house might blow away. Literally, my house might blow away. The media industry, and in particular at this moment, news journalism, has an obligation to viewers and to this country to not take these rights for granted and to leverage our platforms to protect all of the First Amendment's rights for every American, regardless of color, race, etc. So media, particularly broadcasters of news, are not the bad guys here. That's really important, right? But they are in an incredible position of power and influence and have to decide. So there's a short-term gain to be had in leveraging the unrest in America as an opportunity to increase ratings, as well as there was with COVID, right? Or there's a long tail that will require courage and conviction to ultimately decide to lead with journalistic integrity and work to suffocate bias by presenting objective coverage of politics, events, and crises. It's not my intention to call out or myopically focus on news, but I believe it deserves a spotlight because of how important it is to sellers of TV advertising, having gotten through that as their growth medium when they lost their most valuable inventory during COVID. And then ultimately now that we have these tensions and this unrest in our country, there is further impact there. And the second half of 2020 is going to be critical, and media is going to be of paramount importance in helping our nation heal, because ultimately it's an election year. And it is political advertising that is going to help sellers of media be flat, particularly television sellers, remain flat, or potentially even see growth in this year when all signs tell us that we should have been down year over year because of COVID and now because of what's happening. So I suspect that some of these numbers may need to be revised, but estimates on political TV spend right now are at $6.7 billion for this year. That is up from $6 billion prior to COVID. Because this is an election year, the freedom of press is more important than ever. And there's this thing that keeps kind of sticking to me, right? This is my rub that I had to sort of vet. And it's why ultimately this requires a conscious collective for us as an industry at this time. We have to form, the same sort of approach and perspective about our shared responsibilities across the value chain to enable media to be part of the change and to ultimately heal America, right? Ratings matter, that's a truth, and ratings drive revenue, that's another truth. So news, more so on television, slants ever increasingly more negative, right? And if you sort of look into this, it's consistent, it's measurable, it's quantifiable, it's objective, right? And that is because there is this human sort of condition called the negativity bias that provides scientific proof that negative headlines drive better ratings, which drives more revenue. Right? Which is why the news broadcasters and news programmers are not the bad guys. So I want to describe this to you, right? So the negativity bias is also known as the negativity effect. It is the notion that even when of equal intensity, things of a more negative nature, i.e. unpleasant thoughts, emotions, social interactions, harmful traumatic events, have a greater effect on one's psychological state and processes than neutral or positive things. In other words, something very positive will generally have less of an impact on a person's behavior or resonance and cognition than something equally emotional but negative. This goes back to biology. So if something was a danger to us or hurt us or was a threat, we are biologically predisposed to remember those things because that is our survival instinct. So this is just science, right? And, further on, there was some interesting research, which is having studied the negativity bias and then sort of led me to this research that I found that was published in August of last year by students from Columbia, Carnegie Mellon, and the Indian Institute of Technology that studied sentiment polarity of headlines of news outlets on social media, right? And they scored them as either negative, positive, or neutral. So from a +5, -5, and then 0, obviously in the middle being neutral. And they looked at radio, print, and television broadcasters' social media habits and headlines, right? And they found that television news networks consistently publish negative headlines, while print and radio skew neutral to positive. And not surprisingly, the more negative the headline, the more likely it was to be shared. Again, why our news broadcasters and programmers are not the bad guys. Panic porn works, right? It gets attention, it evokes reaction, is memorable, and ultimately results in more revenue for TV programmers. And they're in the business, right? They provide us a service in exchange for value. So much of the TV news on both sides of the divide tends to amplify and provide airtime to the rampant political propaganda. And I don't care what side of the aisle you sit on, it's both sides, right? And this often lends support to diminishing the rights of our citizens in some way. So silence the press doesn't serve us, right? And silencing the press, we hear often within this propaganda if it doesn't serve either party, either side, or one's agenda, right? So this idea that we should shut down Twitter if they screen our tweets, or we should go after social media in general, or use force to stop protests because it doesn't serve us and we don't want to hear the message. This is something the media has a choice about how they cover and how they deliver and what headlines they use to convey this information as journalists to America. But the good news is, which we saw with the previous research, is that although negative headlines evoke response, eventually audiences fatigue from hearing the sky is falling over and over again as an unchanged narrative. That's what we saw with COVID. So the time has come for us as an industry to take responsibility for the role we play in perpetuating fear, hate, and divide in our nation. We still have a free press. Let's not forget that. It feels like it's under attack and it's at risk, but we still have this. And this is a Cartesian moment for us to choose our own future and our destiny for media. We can choose to be part of the collapse of America and further division and proliferation of hate and racism and all the other nastiness that we are seeing coming out in some of our citizens, a very, very small number, or the beginning of healing of America. We're still a United States, right? Not sure we're so united. Media can play a role in returning that. There will be short-term consequences. I own that. I consider myself a conscious capitalist. And as a conscious capitalist, I recognize there are short-term economic costs, right? And consequences. But the long-term cost will be much greater if we do not leverage the power we have to help bridge the division in our country right fucking now. We must use the power and platforms we have, and our media dollars in particular, to work as a unified industry that chooses to embrace hope and love in lieu of hate. Brands and advertisers are going to be forced to not only reintroduce their brands in a new context to consumers, because the experience of interacting with those brands and discovering them has greatly changed. But they're also going to have to find their purpose and convey it in a way that is real and relatable to consumers. Colleen DeCourcy, who is a badass titan of the industry and co-president and chief creative officer at Wieden & Kennedy, was asked by Fast Company a week or so ago when discussing the effect of COVID on brands, what she thinks. And she said, what I think the optimistic part of this is, the longer it goes on, the more people's minds are going to be wiped of brand preferences in many instances. That specific brand of toothpaste is going to matter to me less than just toothpaste. I think when people start to step outside again, brands will be reproving themselves, reintroducing themselves, restating why they should be a preference. We've talked about death of irony before, but I think this could be the death of bullshit. What did a campaign or ad do? What did it do for the brand? What did it do for the people? So eloquently has she put forth the reality facing brands and advertisers in the future and the buy side of our value chain, that you got to start over in some ways. The new normal is absolutely new, and you have to begin to ultimately start over from the beginning in creating new relationships and perceptions with your brand, and ultimately reintroducing your brand to consumers. And the media in which you do that is going to be critical in your success. In research done by Porter Novelli, Colleen's thesis was confirmed. So there's also empirical evidence to back this. This was all before the aftershock of COVID, right? So it came in the forward of before we had the protests and this unrest that we have now. And I suspect that actually would drive these statistics up, which are already pretty incredibly high. So 77% of Americans believe companies must prove they are making decisions in the national interest. And 75% said that the way companies act in the coming months will have direct impact on whether they support them in the future. Wow, that advertising creative and message is more important than ever, isn't it? The unprecedented chain of events over the last 90 days have resulted in Americans being tired of the constancy of doom and gloom from media, and they have reset their expectations for brands and their brand loyalties. Brands, America's woke. They are taking to the streets, speaking out, and finding their voice. It is not one of hate, but of love and of hope. And you must choose which of these options your brand will align, resonate, and embrace. You can draft off of fear for short-term gains and panic, or you can choose to be a lighthouse. And I'm going to tell you and give you a hint, love always wins. If this is a wake-up call to all of us, then we are never going to be woke as an industry. Your power is without bound, brands. Your power lies in every dollar you spend on the advertising, the message within your creative, and the content aside which you choose to be seen. It is brands that provide messages of empowerment, love, and equality that give voices to those that cannot speak because they cannot breathe, like Nike. It is these brands that will remain buoyant during these times. Nike's ad, "For once, don't do it," provided signal in the noise of hate and violence that has been the focal point of media coverage of late. Resonance and relevance and meeting. That is what they delivered. During Corona, we saw brands that got the message that celebrating what is wonderful about this country and finding and mining hope and using that and love to be their narrative that rose to the top, right? They were the signal in the noise. And it is what their consumers needed to hear more than their brand story. They recognized that. They looked at the lens of what their consumers needed without hubris. Apple, Uber, Budweiser. In the midst of this unrest right now, Peloton, Target, and others are declaring a stop to the hate, an end to racism, and it won't only matter that they change their message, but they also have to ensure that they give their media dollars to sellers that share their same values. If we choose to act as an industry with a collective consciousness, we can literally change the world. We can start by changing our fate as a country. And if the entirety of our industry declares that there is no place for hate and aligns their creative, investment, and programming, we can prove that when we do good, we will do well. American brands weave the fabric of American culture. This period of darkness has reset the relationships we have with brands and what they mean to us, and that creates an incredible opportunity. Again, this is all happening for us, not to us. And advertising can be the medium with which new relationships are defined and forged. It has historically been, and it will continue to be. By holding media sellers to a higher standard and our brands, the same standard to which American consumers are going to hold brands in the future, we can fuel as an industry and a value chain the fire of change. And let me say it again. This reset has created an opportunity for our industry to do good and do well, and to bring us deep self-awareness and a sense of gratitude and obligation to serve the freedom of press that we have in this country. This is how the seeds of long-term sustainable and renewable economic value and revenue are planted today. Allowing our programming, our headlines, and creative messaging to be solely reactive in times of crisis might present short-term upside, but it is not going to help your company weather the storms that still lie ahead. Do you want to thrive, or do you want to survive? The rights and liberties afforded to us as Americans are what will power the light that displaces the darkness that surrounds us. We can together as a collective be the megaphone with which love speaks louder than hate
and as a result, connect with consumers and viewers in ways that transcend loyalty and embody trust and hope. We are the ones that can and will make America great again.
Thank you for listening.
Light to all, love to all, and peace to all.